So we'll begin with voter suppression. So this past Tuesday, Wisconsin held a primary that honestly should not have happened at all. There were, uh, with this pandemic going on, it's clear that there will be transmission of cases. More people will get sick. More people will die. We're going to be flooding these hospitals. So it was bad for it to happen at all. But there were two sides that had very strong reasons to want it to happen, and they were both pushing for it. So we'll start with the Democratic side, which is with this Wisconsin primary. Obviously, there's the Democratic primary happening between Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders, and Joe Biden was actually pushing for, in the days leading up to this primary, just like the other primaries that happened earlier on when this pandemic was starting to take hold, he's pushing for in-person voting to happen. He wanted it to go through. And the reason why he was doing that is he wants to shore up his electoral win. So this was before Bernie Sanders dropped out. Joe Biden and the Democratic Party were trying to wrap up this primary as soon as possible because Joe Biden honestly is not a great candidate. They didn't want the people to notice that. We'll actually get down later on to that people already are regretting going for Joe Biden and voting for him. So yeah, Joe Biden was pushing for this primary to happen. Afterward, he said that it shouldn't have happened, that it was a threat to people's health. It doesn't matter because he wanted it to go on. But on the flip side, the GOP was similarly pushing for there to be a primary. In fact, they were the ones that were bringing it to court and arguing it. So in the end, it was the GOP for why the primary happened. Joe Biden was pushing for it, but just kind of rhetorically, but the GOP was actually taking it to court. Now, the reason the Republican Party wanted this primary to happen is there was a state Supreme Court seat up for grabs. So right now, the Republicans have a 3-2 advantage for the Supreme Court seat, and if turnout is high, that typically tends to hurt Republican Party, so they want to keep turnout as low as possible. End up being, I think, around like 3%. So with turnout so low, they almost certainly got their Supreme Court seat held. The results are not out yet because there's a lot of vote by mail that's been going on, and the vote by mail just needs to be postmarked by April 6th, April 7th, not exactly sure when. So votes are still coming in, they're still processing it. But with turnout so low at just 3% of eligible voters in Wisconsin coming, it's very likely that the Republicans held on to the Supreme Court seat. Now, this is actually very important as we move into the November election. So the Republican Party wanted to hold on to this seat because Wisconsin is a case study in how bad you can get with gerrymandering. So in 2018, I believe, they received 46% of the vote, but ended up with 64% of the state's assembly or state senate seats. I'm not exactly sure which one. And that's because they were able to systematically rig the system so that it benefits them. Now with this pandemic going on, it's just more cover and a greater guise that they can disenfranchise more people, they can reduce the vote count, so that when we come into November, Wisconsin is still locked up for the Republican Party, which is notably going to help Trump. Wisconsin is one of those swing states that went for Trump over Clinton in 2016, ended up, being part of the reason why the election was flipped toward him, despite a lot of people and a lot of models showing that Clinton was more likely to win. So with the success in voter suppression in Wisconsin, especially using the pandemic as a cover, it's more likely that other states will be using the same thing. So the COVID-19 is turning out to be more than just an economic catastrophe with the stock market falling incredible amounts, but also with unemployment already getting up into, I think, 16 million with this week's unemployment report numbers. That number is, right now, it is effectively a 10% unemployment rate. It's expected to go as high as 20 to 30%. We're seeing it affect, of course, health. It's a virus, so it's going to be putting people in the hospital. It's going to be affecting their finances in that regard as people lose their insurance. It's going to be affecting our mental health as we're all kind of strapped indoors. So there's all these other problems and effects that COVID-19 is having, but now it's starting to pave the way for an electoral implication. We're only about a month or so into the actual, getting hits with the pandemic. It's, of course, been around for a lot longer, but at least here in New York, they only started closing things down around, at least where I worked, was closed down March 12th, and I think that was pretty early, and other places started following suit, public schools, all that. So we're only a month in, and we haven't even come close to the peak. There are projections, so on covidactnow.org, it's not projected that we will hit the peak, at least in New York State, until about mid-May. But that's all kind of ignoring the fact that these pandemics tend to come in waves. So even if this first wave lasts through just June or something, which seems to be the general projection, at least early on when they did 90-day moratoriums on evictions and a 90-day moratorium on mortgages, even if the first wave just lasts that long, once people start to go out and start to work again, there's going to be a second wave and possibly even a third wave after that. This is how these pandemics go along. The 1918 Spanish flu did the exact same thing. So what that means is that we're likely still going to be under some sort of, quarantine, lockdown, COVID-19, fear when the general election happens. I don't know. I don't think that we are going to be postponing it, but that might be, but it doesn't even need to be postponed because the GOP, with using Wisconsin as an example, where they can suppress votes, or they can, close down polling locations. I mean, in Milwaukee, there were originally 180 polling locations, and then they reduced it down to 5, mainly because, poll workers weren't showing up, but also because it's a benefit for them to close down as many as possible. That's not smart in the context of pandemics. Now you're putting more people into a more concentrated location. So it doesn't even make sense at the out front, but that's how it ended up being. So if we go into November and the election, is on schedule, we're going for the general, I think, November 4th, November 5th, what's going to happen is they might be able to use the same kind of tactics Wisconsin rolled out, maybe some of these further states with the primary, even though, it's not contested on the Democratic side, these states will still hold primaries for delegates and for whatever, for local elections. We're going to probably see a lot of states using COVID-19 as a kind of a trial run to see how they can suppress the vote in order to directly benefit their constituency. I mean, Trump, when he gave a press conference where he talked about, mail-in voting, and a reporter asked him, I think it was from NBC, let me double check this. MSNBC, so on April 8th, so that was this past Wednesday, a reporter asked him, what do you think about mail-in voting? That's a great way where we can avoid kind of this mess of a bunch of people coming in to a location trying to vote. And Trump very steadfastly said, no, we should not do that because it's high chance of voter fraud. This is actually just not true. I mean, experts have come out and done analysis, done studies, and said, no, there's slightly more voter fraud with mail-in voting, but it's so insignificant in the grand scheme of things that there's no reason why we should ban mail-in voting, which increases voter turnout and increases access to the ballot, just because there might be a small uptick in what is already an extremely small, extremely minute number of cases and problems of voter fraud. But his reasoning was the most telling, which is that if you get ballots out to more people, then the Republicans are not going to win. It's that, like I said before, it's pretty common knowledge that when voter turnout goes up, the Democrats tend to fare better. And so with mail-in voting, it's likely going to be that case. But here's the thing is, right now in 2 states, Washington and Colorado, there's already universal mail-in voting. So I'm originally from Washington State. When the 2016 election was going on, I was here in New York, and my parents, they received my ballot, and they just mailed it to me in New York, and I filled it out, and I mailed it back. So it's already been done, and as far as I can tell, I've not seen a single study that goes through, okay, with Washington and Colorado, there's rampant voter fraud. Let us tell you why there's such rampant voter fraud. It's because of the mail-in vote. That's just not a thing. It's a scare tactic that's used. And so the solution to this COVID-19, reducing the vote and making polling places literal possible, death traps, for mail-in voting, there's hesitation to do that because the right knows that they are going to be losing electoral seats. Like I said, we'll see how this moves forward, how further primaries go with either reducing voter turnout, or maybe there will be some clever, creative ways to make it seem like voter turnout is going to go up and there's increased access, but actually there isn't. I don't know, but it's very telling and very worrying that this pandemic is already being used as a scapegoat to further these electoral wants and the electoral chances of a particular party. Um, Naomi Klein's shock doctrine, which kind of breaks all this stuff down, how when there is mind you, I haven't read the book yet, it's on my list, I'm going to be reading it, but from what I understand, it's the idea that when there is a mass shock to the system, and people are kind of like scrambling to figure it out, those who are already in power use this as an excuse to further the ends that they already hold. So that could play out with COVID-19, where the GOP and the Republican Party use this shock of a pandemic to further disenfranchise people and secure their own kind of careers and futures moving forward.